This is Shannon Bradford, and you're listening to UC3P.
We live in an incredible city, Chicago, the city of big shoulders, the windy city, the city that works. The second city is complicated. It's simultaneously beautiful and brutal, from quiet, leafy residential neighborhoods to the steel skyscrapers of the Loop. Roughly 2.7 million people live here, and each has a story to tell. I'm Steve Crano.
I'm Kyra Sturgill.
From University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts.
This is Chicagoland. With each episode, we aim to bring you stories from Chicagoans who are working to improve their communities. We'll speak with community leaders, educators, students, public officials, and other stakeholders who are investing time, energy, and resources into this city.
On Chicagoland, we want to explore how the communities we live in shape our identities. How is the collective Chicago identity shaped by individuals and institutions? What does a collective identity of Chicago even look like? Or can a single collective identity be achieved in such a diverse, dynamic city that seems both to be constantly evolving and stuck in the past?
Our guest today is Trina Tyler, a first-year MPP here at the Harris School of Public Policy. She is a native Chicagoan and an advocate for police reform and accountability in her hometown.
In the first segment of the show, I interview Trina and Kiera, also a native Southsider, about their respective experiences growing up here in Hyde Park, home of the DuSable Museum, the Museum of Science and Industry, and our very own University of Chicago. In the second segment, Kiera and I will talk to Trina about her work with the Invisible Institute. Stay tuned. Trina Tyler, how you doing?
I'm doing very well. Honestly, how am I doing? You know, I'm here. How are you today?
That's real. I'm also here. Kiera, how are you?
5 weeks.
I'm also here.
Also here?
I'm present.
All right. We're present. We're present. We're conscious. We're going to do this thing. This is the first episode of Chicagoland here on UC3P. And I'm so excited that you're here. I want to ask you both about your experiences growing up here in Chicago. I'm a big fan of this city. I've never lived here until about a month or so ago.
Where you from?
I'm from Columbus, Ohio. All right. Anyway, we'll start with Trina. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up on 54th and Drexel. My parents still live there today.
What neighborhood is 54th and Drexel in?
Honestly, I like to describe it as the borderland. It really is the borderland, right? It's the border between Washington Park and Hyde Park. It's like the last block in Hyde Park.
Okay. We'll come back to that. Kiera?
So I grew up in Hyde Park as well. Moved around a fair bit as a kid, but if we want to say exactly where I was first living as a child, I was 55th and Cornell. So both of us came from places not far from where we are right now.
Which is 1155 East 60th Street, just a few blocks away. Trina, how did your family end up here in Chicago?
My grandmother moved here from Oklahoma after my father was born, like in the 1940s. And then my mother, she migrated here from Memphis, Tennessee in like the 1970s. And really the house that I was raised in on 54th and Drexel, my great grandmother lived there. It was like a three flat home with my uncle, my cousin, and my great grandmother there.
Oh, that's cool. So did your great grandmother follow one of your parents or your grandmother?
I'm not sure. I've been meaning to actually have this conversation with my big mama for quite some time. She actually had a really traumatic childhood. My big mama was born in 1923, I believe. So, like, there's so much happening, and there's so much that she just honestly has never talked to me about. But what I do know for sure is that my great-grandmother started to pay a mortgage on the house on 54th and Drexel. And so I'm the third generation of people to live there.
Wow.
And we owned it we finally owned it while I was there.
Family home.
Mm-hmm.
That's really nice. And Kiera, how did your family end up here?
So my parents were transplants, brought to you by the University of Chicago. My dad came here to attend medical school at Rush Medical Center, and then he did his residency at the University Hospital. My mom attended law school at the university. So they kind of ended up in Hyde Park, had some kids, decided that they liked it, wanted to stay here and raise us here. And I'm really grateful that they did, because I feel like growing up in Hyde Park was definitely a really big part of who I was and who I became.
First, it's interesting that you say like Hyde Park is a huge part of who you are today, because I feel like the borderlands, like where I lived, really has a huge impact on who I am today, because I'm from Hyde Park, quote unquote, but then like I also identify like very closely with the hood. I say like I'm from the low end. I didn't kick it with people who were like living in Hyde Park. Like that was never my experience. Whenever I was in Hyde Park, I was at my grammar school, St. Thomas the Apostle. So I went there from pre-K until 8th grade. That was really my exposure to Hyde Park, like deeper east.
So I know you said that it felt kind of like you were living in a borderland. When you were in one place or the other, did it kind of feel like you were never like fully a part of it?
Oh yeah, like all the time. So when I was coming up, I realized very quickly, I remember tutoring people who were older than me and being really confused by that. I was like, oh snap, like why am I learning this rigor of math, but this person who is like in 2 grades higher than me, not capable of keeping up with it? This seems really problematic. So that was my first kind of separation. But then also like I always got the, you talk like a white girl type thing when I was like in my neighborhood. But then when I was at school, I was like the hood child, the fighter, or like I was the person who was like the closest in proximity to the hood. And so somehow that became reflected in my reputation when I was at school. I was like not proper enough when I was at school, and I also was like not hood enough when I was in the hood. But I found my way at some point, found a very beautiful middle ground that was really authentic to myself and literally is who I am today.
Yeah, and I think when you talk about being kind of on a border, it took me a long time, I think, becoming an adult and actually leaving Chicago, leaving Hyde Park, to kind of understand its role, its position in the South Side. Because my friends and I kind of always felt like it was sort of this unique place, but we didn't really understand why. And I don't think we fully understood why those borders were in place. Like, those borders existed for us too, but like we didn't go past them. You know, you take Lakeshore Drive to get downtown, or you like take Lakeshore Drive or I-94 to get to the north side. And we're like participating kind of in this system that's created such a divided city. You know, we didn't really fully understand what and why that was happening.
So I lived, obviously, like I lived on 54th and Drexel. So there, as gentrification was happening on my block in particular, I saw it happen like wildly. Like I lived through that moment of 54th and Drexel, Maryland Cottage, like being gentrified. But I remember being a young person, and even though I lived in that house, feeling separate from the students who walked up the streets, and they made me feel it too. Like, they were not kind to me, wouldn't say hello, any of that. A lot of times, University of Chicago students are not kind to the people who have been living on those blocks, right? And we've been living there for 23 years, you know what I mean? And people constantly walking past, not saying what's up. So it's like the bubble even exists, even if you live.
Yeah, inside of it.
Inside of it. At least for me, as like a young Black person.
You know, we all just started here at Harris. We're all grad students at UChicago. Has that status as a grad student or just a member of the UChicago community augmented or challenged or changed your identities as Chicagoans? Who's up first? Kiera.
Yeah, I think, well, this has been an interesting experience for me because I lived on the East Coast for the last 8 years. So I've been away from Chicago and from Hyde Park. And I mean, it's been really interesting to not live here and visit, you know, as an outsider for so many years, to see how it's been changing so much. Hyde Park is very different from when I was growing up here as a kid. Like, there was no Target, there was no Whole Foods, there was no Chipotle. But at the same time, I think, you know, obviously I had a different experience living here as a kid than Trina did, kind of being within that bubble. And now that I've had time, you know, away from it, and I'm coming to the University of Chicago to study public policy, I've become a lot more critical about, you know, the role that we all can play in sort of reinforcing these borders that are around us and the way that we treat people who are just outside of it. So it's definitely different. It's definitely a different experience. And I look back on my experience growing up here, not with as much idealism as I think I did when I first left as an 18-year-old. We talk about Chicago being a hyper-segregated city, but I think people in Hyde Park kind of like to think we're exempt from that because demographically you can look at it and we are one of the more integrated neighborhoods, but that's just looking at the numbers.
Yeah. Like
Trina said, you know, even when she was in Hyde Park, it didn't feel like she was, you know, experiencing kind of the same thing when she was interacting with other university students. I don't know. I have a lot of feelings about it. I'm planning on spending my next 2 years here trying to unpack that a little bit. I want to cross those borders. I want to engage with people outside of the bubble.
Trina, how has being a U of C student changed or augmented, altered your identity as a Chicagoan?
This is like two parts. Because one part was like, oh my gosh, I got into the University of Chicago. Wow. And then everybody in my hood was like, yo, like, we're so proud of you. Woo, woo, woo. Like, I mean, people were so proud of me because, I mean, I think in my neighborhood, I've always been known as like college girl or whatever. Like, I remember being when I was in college. Oh my gosh. I used to, in Washington Park, people like used to congregate there a lot. But I used to sell loose squares and swishers, like, to people. Like, literally, I used to walk down the street, up and down in the park and be like, loose squares, fuck with me. I'm a college girl. Come on, I'm trying to pay this tuition. I was, like, known as the college girl. And then to go to the University of Chicago, then, of course, like, they're super proud and they're, like, super excited for me. The people who I associate with have always known that I've kind of been just pretty nerdy forever. But then there's this other piece of me that is, man, the University of Chicago has very intentionally pushed my people out of this block, right? And there are many people who may assume that I don't belong there or have judgments about me or about my background, which sometimes will be right and sometimes will be very wrong. There's some part of me that is frustrated with myself for acknowledging this like very elitist place as a place where I want to be. So it's two parts, you know? I don't know.
People are complicated, and that's one of the themes of the show. We're going to be right back, change gears. Kiera's going to hop in on some interview questions with me. Don't go away.
As China's role grows greater on the global stage, you want to stay up to date on the issues most pressing to China both domestically and internationally. Check out the Just China podcast for in-depth analysis on recent headlines and investigative reports on Chinese matters that affect our globalized world. We are Just China. Find us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you enjoy your podcast listening.
Hey, Trina.
Hey.
All right, so we're going to change it up a little bit in this segment. More on what kind of work Trina does here in Chicago. What does it mean to be a prison abolitionist?
To me, when I think of prison abolition, I instantly think about like radical love and I think about freedom. I know a lot of people don't think about it like that. I think a lot of times when people hear prison abolition, they instantly start thinking about like, what about the rapists and the murderers and the pedophiles? And I'm just like, okay, yeah, what about them? How do we need to like radically shift our ideas around accountability? Because prison doesn't stop rapists from raping people. And prison doesn't stop murderers from murdering people. Because people don't wake up one day and say, I'm going to kill somebody. What happens is there's a series of events, things that many times people don't have a choice in, that leads them to decide to take an action that sometimes leads to murder. Or sometimes there's an environment that's created that heightens murder as the tool or the weapon that people have their hands on. And so that's what they act upon. So for me, prison abolition means divesting from prisons and investing more into education. And when I think about rapists, I think about consent and how many conversations we never had. Nobody listening to this, maybe like 1 out of 10 people listening to this really had some intentional conversations about consent. But I think about talking about consent with young people from the ages of like 2 and 3, you know what I mean, up until high school.